Welcome to the Chosson and Kallah Shmooze you wish you had but never got, Part 10. I remind everybody to please listen to these discussions from beginning to end. Now, if you search Chosson and Kallah Shmooze you wish you had but never got intro, then you'll be able to start from the first one and work your way through. It is extremely important that you do that because we need to prepare ourselves for extremely sensitive discussions. In fact, today we're going to begin to talk about sexual intimacy, its role psychologically and halachically and hashkafically in Jewish marriage. And in order to do that, we have to recognize that this is certainly not in an ideal circumstance. It's important to know that our chachamim, our sages, were reluctant for these matters to be discussed in a public forum. It says in the Mishnah, you can find it in Chagiga on Yud Aleph Amud Beis 11b, Ein Dorshin B'Arayis B'fnei Shlosha, that the halachas of sexual morality and sexual regulation is to be discussed not in front of three, only two, that is, teacher to student. So we have a potential problem over here in broadcasting this online. Yet we have some precedent. Interestingly enough, the same Mishnah and the same discussion that goes into what we do not discuss publicly also discusses what are considered the more esoteric secrets of the Torah. And the Rambam in his Hakdama to Mor Nevuchim has a conundrum because he knows that people are struggling with very difficult issues regarding the intersection of science and philosophy and Torah, and yet he feels in order to answer those questions, it would require to discuss them in a book. And that, in essence, would be a violation also, because it talks about Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereshis, which loosely translates into, or at least according to the Rambam, not according to the mystics, but at least according to the Rambam, that translates into physics and metaphysics, which he has a big problem. And he rationalizes it in a number of ways, which we can utilize for ourselves. First of all, the need. The need is extremely important. He uses another rationalization which will not help us. In fact, it will make things worse, is that he only hints at certain things and alludes to it, and even sometimes deliberately says the opposite of what it's supposed to mean. Now that is something that he had as a recourse. For us, if we leave things to vagueness, we will be doing people a disservice. In fact, by being vague, we will perpetuate the problems that have plagued people, particularly in this generation, in not getting proper and clear halachic and psychological guidance for sexuality. Now, either in previous times that was not necessary, and it was a given that a father gave over to his son, or a mother gave over to her daughter, or a master gave over to a student, these important ideas. But whatever the case may be, it's not being done properly, and people are suffering. However, there are some other devices we could use that the Rambam did use. For example, the Guide for the Perplexed was a letter, actually. Originally, it was a series of letters sent to a student of his. His name was Yosef. If we are to allow legal fictions like the Rambam clearly was doing. In other words, I'm not teaching to the public, I'm writing a letter. It just so happens that everybody read. I would ask you to consider that I'm talking to each and one of you alone, individually, and not as a group. So therefore, we have that argument. Furthermore, although this argument will be a little bit weaker when this will eventually be made into a podcast, but right now this is a YouTube video, and the reality is anybody who's on YouTube has seen far worse and heard far worse than anything I could possibly say in the name of Torah. So we need to be realistic about this. The idea itself of understanding the actual nuts and bolts of sexuality is extremely important. Igros Moshe in Even Ezer Chelik Aleph, responsa number 102 actually says it's permitted for someone to read secular sex manuals in order to understand how to do the mitzvah, because the mitzvah in particular of sexual relations is to bring pleasure to your wife. Yes, we can talk about this another time, which is why there seems to be this disparity between men and women, but the mitzvah is to give sexual pleasure to your wife. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but it is a mitzvah, and the fact is that it is both an art and a science to learn how to make love properly. And like many mitzvahs, you need to prepare. If one wants to be a scribe, you can't learn how to be a scribe from opening up Shulchan Aruch. That's not going to work. You can learn the halachas of being a scribe, but you can't learn how to be a scribe from Shulchan Aruch. It's like if you want to learn how to drive, you could read the driver's manual and you could learn the laws, but that's not going to teach you how to drive. You have to learn how to drive. It is a combination of experience and having a mentor. So too, when it comes to being a good lover, yes, a good lover, it takes time and experience and perhaps even mentoring. So we are going to, as these discussions progress, we are going to get into quite a bit of detail, as much as necessary, in order to accomplish the purpose of helping people have an authentic Torah view and a healthy psychological view on sexual and marital intimacy. For those who are interested as well, there is a PDF that I have available of most of the source material of these discussions. So let's start out with a principle that is just good to know. It's always good to see how the sages of the Gemara and the Talmud and the Midrash were so in tune and aware of the realities of life. They didn't live in a bubble, and also it's an accumulated wisdom of hundreds of years. The Gemara itself was recorded over hundreds of years, let alone the Mishnah. So there's a lot of material there, a lot of experience, and they, interestingly enough, basically refer to the male sexual organ as the Mesim Shalom, as the Peacemaker. You can find that in Shabbos, in Tractate Shabbos 152a, Kufnin Beis Amud Aleph. What in the world are they talking about? Why in the world is that a peacemaker? Now, that really depends, I suppose. But clearly, they're recognizing that in its time and in its place, sexuality. They didn't say the tongue, to talk sweetly, even though that's very important, and we will get to that. But actual sexuality is a peacemaker. It is what I like to refer to as God's glue. When two people have a passionate experience, and they truly give each other ecstatic pleasure, it creates a bond between the two people. That bond is powerful. That bond transcends and surmounts many difficulties. I don't see that as sweeping the dirt under the rug. Not at all. I see that as something powerful and valuable in and of itself. Now, that doesn't mean that one can readily achieve sexual intimacy without emotional intimacy. Many times, people, more often women than men, but not as much as you think, it's probably about a 70-30 split in my experience. But many women feel the need for an emotional connection before they can become sexually aroused, and some men do. More men do than would admit. I have certainly seen in my office people who have objectively very attractive spouses, and they don't find themselves aroused or able to function sexually because they don't feel happy or connected to their spouse. But in any case, it is a type of personality. And yes, maybe it is more common with women than men, but it is certainly a truth. And these truths are cosmic. They're not only about a man-woman relationship. The world itself functions with a merger of opposites. we find even, according to the mystics, there is midat hadin and midat harachman. There's the aspect of God that represents mercy and the aspect of God that represents justice. There is even amongst humans, there's intellect and there's emotions. There's even in religious worship, there's to worship God out of fear and to worship God out of love. The point is that many times in our reality that we live in, which is made in the image of God, because God can only craft, so to speak, and create something that is representative of his ultimate truths, and God cannot lie. Everything that's made somehow or another has God's fingerprints on it. And there's a duality that we're taught, according to the mystics, exists within God himself, even though God is one, but there are different ways that God manifests himself in this world. And within us, we have these dualities too. And this encounter between man and woman, this idea that there needs to be a representation of the softer emotional side and the more powerful, let us say, intellectual side, or emotional intimacy and sexual aggression, they both need to be respected and appreciated. And when they both are in the right form and the right way, then you achieve a very special kind of union. And that union, according to the mystics, reverberates throughout the cosmos and goes all the way up to heaven and reaches some special place and elevates this couple. And this is what we have before us. This is our challenge. Our challenge is to respect in our marriage and even within ourselves these two aspects: the powerful, raw, sexual passion, which is extremely important and not to be underestimated. But within that also, there is the emotional intimacy, the emotional openness, the love and the connection that also cannot be ignored. And it is not for nothing that couples wrestle with this. They wrestle with this because this is a lifelong dynamic. Just as we are taught that within God's manifestation in this world, there are different partsufim, that there are different representations. And these representations can be sometimes harsh and sometimes loving, sometimes emotional, sometimes intellectual. So too within us. And within our relationship is the ability to further and further create more peace and more connection on all these fronts and the right balance. And when we achieve that, we achieve emotional union, psychological union, and spiritual union.